We are now joined by Rebecca Winthrop, Senior Fellow and Director at the Center for Universal Education, the Brookings Institution. To what extent do you think that education systems should be developed around creativity and creative thinking? Is it really a vital skill?
It's a really good question, and it's a question that we've been debating here at this conference in various sessions. I think it's more of a vital skill today than it was, 30 years ago, in part because of the labor skills that are needed and the type of skills that are needed in the workplace. But of course, creativity is not just needed for work. Creativity is important for solving our social problems, for figuring out how to do things better in our family lives. But one thing that I think is very interesting is there was a very broad consensus in the Education for All goals. This was made by the world's education ministers. They came together in 1990 and then in 2000. And one of the things they agreed on, every education minister around the world said one of the goals should be to make sure that young children should have measurable learning outcomes in literacy, numeracy, and quote unquote essential life skills. Now, I'm not sure if they were thinking creativity would be an essential life skill. Or if they were thinking financial, how to use numbers and, in your life for financial management or something like that. But I would argue that actually it is probably an essential life skill. It should be classified today as an essential life skill because the world is changing very rapidly with the progress of technology, and young people more than ever before are going to have to come out of their education trying to be able to solve problems and come up with new ways to do things, which is at the heart of creativity.
One of the key points that was highlighted yesterday in the opening sessions is that it is the time to bridge the gap between the education we have and the education we need, and that's why we are all discussing these topics on creativity, innovation and critical thinking. What do you think, or how do you think we can bridge this gap?
Well, that's $1 million question. If I had the answer, I'm sure I would be a very wealthy woman. People are trying to bridge the gap in very different ways, and probably some of them are more fruitful than others. One thing that I think is incredibly important is to try to empower teachers, support teachers, not make teachers out to be the bad guy. There are lots of wonderful teachers around the world who are very interested in helping students have a love of learning, in giving space for students to have self-directed learning. All of those strategies are very important for letting young people develop not only critical thinking skills, but skills that would lead to creativity. And certainly in a lot of education systems, it's maybe less the teachers themselves and more the demands of how much curriculum needs to be reviewed, the types of tests that need to be reported on. There's lots of demands in education systems that can kind of squash perhaps the self-directed learning that teachers might be more willing to take if they had the time or were supported to do it in their educational environment. So that's one crucial piece. There's lots of other ways as well to bridge the gap, but we have, millions and millions of teachers around the world already in place, so we should start with them.
But does this mean we have to radically or completely reimagine education systems, or rewrite curriculums, or change completely the methods and approaches?
There's a couple of different schools of thought on that. There's one group who really believes that actually we're post-school. We should do away with schools. They stifle creativity, stifle free thought, are drum out sort of love of learning and student initiative, are focused on memorizing knowledge, which in fact was very useful, how much you know and what you knew 100 years ago. But now that we have Google, and the truth is not everybody has Google, so we should remember that, but by large part, now that we are able to get content knowledge relatively quickly, what we should focus on is how to think, how to solve problems, how to combine different ideas to create something better, how to keep learning. So that group often thinks that we should just do away with schools altogether and let's have peer learning, as an example, peer learning networks that are supported by members of the community, and you could have mobile phones and smartphones, delivering content knowledge, and there could be all different models. And another group says, listen, it's already been a great achievement to get kids in school. It's actually one of the world's, amazing interventions for scaling an approach. And if we have a whole set of infrastructure and we already have the hardware in place, let's try to change the software. So what is done inside schools? What is done with teachers? So I think probably somewhere in the middle is true, and I think it might depend on the context. I can't imagine a place like the United States or some place that's heavily regulated, in the next 5-10 years just doing away with schools altogether. I could imagine some of the places in the world that have very limited access to school, have very few teachers who've gotten the support and development they need to be, very masterful. Those places actually coming up with brand new models and perhaps leapfrogging ahead. Most of those places are in the developing world, and that could really be a way that they leapfrog ahead in terms of teaching and learning processes and student outcomes.
Obviously, there is kind of a shift from a one-size-fits-all, but how can we avoid from going to a free-for-all? There is a thin line here.
What do you mean, in terms of education systems, or one size fits all of what?
Usually it's a predetermined curriculum.
Right.
Now we are going to a more free style of learning, more personalized learning. Yeah. But this could go too far, so how can we make sure we keep the balance?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good question, and a question that a lot of perhaps educational ed tech entrepreneurs don't necessarily answer, because we've basically in the world, what we've done is go to mass education. That has been it's actually an incredible human rights achievement. We've had education, personalized learning for centuries. It's just been with a very elite group of people, an apprentice and a master, a guru and, a mentor. So that has existed. It's just been for the very few. And one of the great human rights achievements of this past century has been going to mass education. So the question now is, can we go to mass education that's mass personalization? Ed tech folks are very excited by this, and indeed technology could pose a radically new way to do it. You could have students learning at their own pace in a classroom. The question is, if you just leave students on their own to learn at their own pace, I'm a firm believer that you're going to need some form of teacher. You have to have some form of social discussion and connection. We are, animals, and we're social beings. That's an incredible piece to learning. And then the other question, which is I think what you're getting at, is if we just let students sort of be self-directed learning and choose what they're passionate about, how do we know for sure that they're going to choose the range of things that are needed to be a well-rounded human being? And who is saying what is good norms and values? There are values in education. The Taliban has education. Just like, the United States and where I come from in my community, we have education. They're different value sets. The public schools in Washington, D.C., from the schools run by Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, for example. So if it's totally free, who's choosing what the values are? So and there's no clear answer to that, except probably for there to be some form of regulation or government oversight. And if absent government, I'm not sure who it would be.
There's a lot of emphasis on the advantages of creativity, but could there be any disadvantages?
I don't think there's such a thing as someone being too creative being bad. And so I don't think there's disadvantages for an individual. I think in terms of an education system, what we often see in education reform that is the risk is pendulums swing from one side and then they go all the way to the next side. So there can be sort of throwing baby out with the bathwater. There could be a risk that, there's increasing emphasis on creativity. And mind you, we're at a conference focused on creativity in education, so these are the people around the world who are focused on it. Lots of education systems are not necessarily talking about it. So there's probably a lot of room for education systems to talk about creativity more and not really swing very far. But there could be a possible risk I could see in the future, is if you focus too much on creativity, I wouldn't say too much, but at the expense of not ensuring that young people are mastering core foundational skills that they need to master. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, particularly if you talk about technology, is something you can really only reap the benefits for, at least today, the technology today, if you're very fluent, if you're literate in a language that technology is available in. This technology is one example, right? You have to know basic numeracy. There's a whole set of social competencies, social and emotional skills that you really need to be able to be successful in life. So as long as those things are attended to, and in many parts of the world, kids are in school and they're not learning these basics. So you wouldn't want to forget about that. That could be possibly the only risk.
Going back to your point about that creativity's demand is to address the needs of today's world and economy. In this context, what is the role the private sector plays?
It's a very good point, and I think that there's going to be a couple of things that will probably break out massively educational change. One is the private sector not using school credentials as a marker for skills. In the past, school credentials have been a market indicator of skill level. And private sector is not the only employer, but it's an employer that innovates much more rapidly, and it's also a source of economic growth. And so it's a big, important chunk of society, or the labor market. And if and it's already starting to happen in many developed countries, slowly, if they're not using school certificates as a marker for skills, what are they looking at? And so by really trying to look at competencies and skills, that could really drive change within education systems. I mean, why do you need to be in school for 12 years? What if a kid masters all the competencies in, 10? Allowing for flexibility would be incredibly helpful in sort of trying to drive that change. The other piece, I think, in terms of the role of the private sector, is we should also make sure we find a role that's useful for them. I think it would be important for the private sector to say what types of skills and competencies they need, and we know already from the number of studies that have been done across the private sector and across sort of employee needs labor market surveys, that the skills that are missing across most companies, this is sort of globally, and of course it's specialized in different labor markets in different countries, but the skills that are most missing are what people group into different terms, often called the quote-unquote soft skills. And I was at a session yesterday with a bunch of CEOs, and they said, this is what we're missing. It's problem solving, critical thinking, working in teams, being able to figure things out, being able to learn and adapt and grow in their job to different job descriptions year on year, because their business is changing, business models are changing so rapidly. And they said, why, if this is really what we need, why do we keep calling them the soft skills? Shouldn't we be calling them, these are really the hard skills. So I think, help, that could also be very important, sort of driving those other sets of skills that maybe have been neglected in education systems.
So for sure schools are invited to be also creative in order to be able to promote such skills. You've mentioned technologies, but how about play, for example, and the latest trend about serious games?
Play is incredibly important, and you don't need technology to play. And certainly, I think for kids under 2, you shouldn't engage technology. So there's lots of ways to introduce play into education systems. We just had a discussion, I was in a session about early childhood development. And one thing that's interesting about play is there's no one global definition of play. There actually isn't. There's been, people have tried, studies upon studies, and I think that's fine, we can get away with it. But maybe a core principle we could agree on is children, how children perceive play. This was a comment made earlier. Children perceive play when it's self-directed. So saying go play in the corner with your toys all of a sudden becomes work. If you're a mother telling your child. So if a child is, picks up a book and starts reading, that's play for them. Because it's self-directed and self-motivated. So trying to find time and ways within educational systems or learning spaces for self-directed learning is a great way to support play, and giving kids sort of materials and opportunities to engage with different things, but giving them enough time to discover and be self-directed about it.
Speaking of parents and their role, how early should we start with our children in terms of nurturing creativity?
It depends what you mean by nurturing creativity. If you're talking about flashcards and learning sort of colors and words very early, you don't need to start very early on that. The literature is pretty strong. But there's lots of brain development that goes on in young children that is crucial and needs a caring and supportive environment for it to develop. It needs nutrition and basic health levels, and those are important foundations for creativity. And the best thing the parents can do is to engage with their children. And you don't need fancy toys, you don't need lots of resources. There's an incredible study that was done over a very long period of time in Jamaica, where it was very marginalized children, poor children who were stunted, and it was a parenting program where they taught parents to play with household objects with their kids, spoons and other, whatever. Turns out after many years, those kids, a 25% leap forward in their outcomes, and they caught up. And so the best thing, and you can never start too early, start when a kid is born, but it's not about playing with flashcards or trying to support creativity from an adult perspective. It's about engaging, meeting the kids where they're at, loving, engaging, supporting kids.
But how can we assess that our children are creative, or even adults? Is there any
ways to assess creativity? Yeah. There are ways to assess creativity. There are people who are devoting their academic and professional careers to assessing creativity. I wouldn't do it for very young children. I wouldn't sit there with an assessment form. I would look more at the environment around kids and making sure they're getting their needs met and opportunities for exploration. But later on in kids in primary school or secondary school, what you have to do is break down, what does creativity mean? And there's people who are working on that. There a professor named Guy Claxton is an expert in this, and he has broken down what does creativity mean into different habits of minds. And there's a way for teachers to actually see how kids are doing in these different habits of mind. One could be being skeptical to the written word, which of course most school systems don't teach you to do, because you're supposed to learn off the textbook and repeat. So there's lots of ways to break down what creativity means and to try to track in very, very discrete ways, how are kids on these different sets of competencies that make up creativity.
But it's different than the standardized testing. So
yes, very.
Does this mean we have to rethink the whole process of measuring our students' performances?
I think that you have to measure how students are doing. And measurement and assessment is a very hot button, tricky topic. So just saying, I think we have to measure how our students are doing is not the same thing as saying every kid should be given a standardized test, every, several months in their educational career. There's different ways of measuring. You have assessment of learning, which is, how are kids doing. It's kind of a snapshot in time. Often it's done in standardized test form, but there's plenty of education systems around the world, some of the better ones, who don't use standardized tests to measure sort of a snapshot, how are our young people doing. They do essay forms, they do other types of things, and that's very important kind of on a large scale for policymakers. They need to know, to diagnose, how are our kids doing? Are there some schools where kids are really struggling, some parts of the country where they're not doing well? Who are poor kids? Are they doing okay versus more economically well-off kids? So assessment of learning is really important for policymakers and actors. There's also assessment for learning, which is what teachers can use in the classroom to see how kids are doing in order to immediately, real time, give feedback to them. Oh, this student really needs more help on this. Let me try to make sure. Or gosh, most of the students in the classroom, they actually didn't grasp that at all, and I need to readjust my tactics. And that's a much more low intensity in terms of stakes sort of process, and should be done continuously and in an ongoing way, and doesn't at all have to be in a standardized test format.
Finally, standardized testing and having to perform good for exams is one of the main things that is maybe demotivating students. How can we remotivate our learners?
Well, I'm not sure if it's demotivating students. I think it might be crushing their love of learning. I think there's huge countries in Asia where students are incredibly motivated to do very well on their secondary leaving exam or college entrance exam. And the problem is that such stakes for their future lives are placed on it that it's increasing levels of anxiety among kids. It's as if this, how you do on this one exam will determine if you're a good or bad person. So I think there's lots of students who are motivated to do it, but it's more because of societal pressure. So I think your real question is probably around, how can we get an assessment system that allows for different paths, different points of trajectories for success in students' lives. And I think that is something that the world is, very much looking at, and there's different examples from different countries on how to do it. But high stakes exams can be, very counterproductive to that effort of having different paths for different people.
Rebecca, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.